Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from AlexMercedCoder.dev. And in this video, I wanted to do is show you how to implement a tRPC server in a solid J. Not solid JS, but in solid start. Okay, so there's kind of an example of this in the docs, and that example pretty much shows you the full thing. But here I'm going to give you some more explanation of what the different pieces are doing and a little bit more about what tRPC is. Okay, so there's basically a thing called RPC, Remote Procedure Call. Essentially, what remote procedure call is a style of creating a client-server relationship. So again, there's like a REST, where basically anytime you need something, you hit a particular URL. So you have a URL for every individual action that should be done on your server, and then basically the client, your front end framework is able to designate, hey, I want this to happen because it sends a request to a certain URL. Then there's GraphQL, where instead of saying, hey, there's all these different URLs, you have one endpoint, and you send this query string. The query string is parsed, and which resolver you hit, which query or mutation you end up doing on the server is dependent on that string that you send over. Now, basically the way RPC works is that what you do is you're defining a bunch of functions on the back end. And what's happening is that you create a interface, a client on the front end that allows you to call those actions on the server without necessarily having to make a fetch request. So a fetch request is happening, like you are making a request to the server, but that's not how you do it. What you do is you call a function, which then will call that function in some way. So in this case with tRPC, or at least the way it's going to work here, is that essentially we're taking an endpoint, and then what it does, it adds the name of the function you want at the end of that URL. Although you don't see this happening, instead you just call the function like you're calling any function, but what you're doing is that you're calling a function on your client and it's triggering an action on your server. And the nice thing about RPC, it just makes it feel more like you're just writing normal code because you're just calling a function. Okay, so here like you can see an example. Like see here's like the client, and I'm calling a function called hello, which is a query, and then I'm just invoking it. Okay, you don't see me having to do any fetch request to a particular URL. It is doing that, but I don't experience that. Okay, so let me show you kind of how I implemented this. Okay, it's a little bit more broken up versus the version you see in the docs. So what I did is, again, let me just break down all of this. Okay, so here's our source folder in solid start. And of course we have you can add a lib folder to put all your all your support stuff. Like basically think of the lib folder as the place where you put stuff that's not your routes. Okay, so any support functions, anything that's not your routes. Okay, so in there I have a folder called tRPC. Okay, that's just the way I decided to organize it. And in here we have I made an init.ts, and again the file names don't particularly matter. But essentially here's where we create our instance of tRPC. Okay, so essentially, and again you do have to install this library so basically there's 3 libraries you would need to install for this. Okay, so let me just go to my package.json for a second. You're going to want to install, are they listed here? They are not listed there at the moment. Okay, but technically, that's because I installed it with pnpm and it didn't add them. I think it's because I was in the wrong folder. So let me just do this again. Install it so you can see it. Here we go. So pnpm install at tRPC server, at tRPC client, and Zod. Okay, so basically the tRPC server is what's going to allow us to create the server side of the API, and at tRPC is going to allow us to create the client, so that way it knows how to communicate with the server. And then Zod is going to be used for validating the input. Okay, the reason why tRPC is called tRPC is because it's built for working with TypeScript. So T for typed RPC. There is another framework you may have heard of, gRPC, and I think this is a G because it was created by Google, so Google RPC. Okay, but generally they're doing the same thing. Okay, the difference is like gRPC, what you do is you create like this proto file, and then the proto file acts as the contract with the client and the server. I have a separate video and blog post on that has nothing to do with solid start, so I'm going to get into it. Okay, so those are the 3 things you would need to install. I'm going to install them again, so that way they get added to the package.json. Okay, did they get added to the package.json? No, I'm not gonna worry about it. Okay. Okay. But I think they are added to like the P and PM lock, I guess. Okay. So I go back to my init. I'm importing this function here to init the tRPC server. So I'm creating the server. And essentially what we're going to do is we're going to export three things. We want to get the router function, which is going to allow us to create a router. A router is just going to be basically a list of the different functions we can call. Middleware, I actually haven't used this yet, so not quite sure. I'm sure that basically allows you to create middleware, so things that run, functions that run before the function you are calling. I just, again, haven't used it. And then there's the procedure function. The procedure function allows you to define the individual procedures. Okay, that's why they call it remote procedure call. Each function is called a procedure. So we're going to export these three things, and then we're going to define a router, which I do here in router.ts. So I'm going to import the router and the procedure function. And what we do is we create a function. If you see the documentation for Solid or the documentation for tRPC, they call this app router, but again, you can call it whatever you want. But this is basically the router for your application, because you generally should only have one, or you should only have one instance of tRPC. You can have multiple routers, but just one instance of tRPC. So like only one time you should be doing what I have here. Okay, so I'm creating this router. Okay, and then this router is basically has these particular functions inside of it. So you see here, there's only one function, hello, and whenever hello is called, it's going to run this procedure, which is a query. Okay, and from what I can tell, the way that there's query and mutation, and basically the way it parses that out is that whenever you call hello as a query, it's going to make a get request to the endpoint, and whenever you do a mutation, it's going to make a post request. So it's going to determine how the client behaves. I guess. I guess we kind of want to play with this, see if I can just put in an arbitrary function. We'll play with that in a second. Okay. But basically then what we can do is we can create another function. So I'm going to make another one called goodbye. Okay, and actually we will test this out. We'll see, hey, can I just put an arbitrary function here, and would it work? Okay, and we're just going to return goodbye, the string of goodbye. I'm going to see if this works. Now, why don't you like it? String is not assignable to type any procedure. Because it's typing. Yes. So I do have to use the procedure. So basically we use this procedure function. And again, if we do dot there, you can see I can create like a mutation or a query. There are other functions in here, so like input. So input is what you would use with that Zod library in order to define what arguments can be passed to this function. Okay, so you can say like, let's see, let me go find the docs so you can see an example. Right here. So you can see an example here. So you see input, and you say z.object, and you're just basically saying what can be passed is an object with a text property of string. Okay, and then basically that's what it will receive. Okay, and that'll be the input. Okay, which gets passed as a property of an object that gets passed in as the argument to the thing. Okay, I'm not going to do that right now, but essentially what this would do is that it would then generate an error if you pass something. It'll do validation. So basically, if you were to pass the wrong argument, you would actually get an informative error. Instead of just saying, hey, it didn't work, it'll tell you, hey, this doesn't look like it should, which is always nice. Okay, validation is always good because you can get better errors, which means better troubleshooting. Okay. But we'll do type procedure.query, and then you pass in a function. Okay. And I am curious, what are the args? So I am going to ingest all the args real quick, see what else is inside that object. Okay. And then I'm going to return goodbye. So this one will return the word goodbye. And I'm going to console log args here so that I can inspect that later. So we can, but see now I've added this endpoint. Okay, so basically I can define as many of these functions, many of these procedures as I want in this object. Okay, and then again, you want to make sure you export this app router because we're going to use that when we're going to be using that throughout our API routes or in different places. Okay. And then you're also going to want to export this type of app router. Okay, and again, what it is basically what you're doing is that you're not saying that this app router is app router, you're saying it's a type. So this is way you can type this thing without you having to sit there and manually have to like define every single property. It's just going to take this object that you created here, figure out what its type is, and then assign it to here, making life a lot easier when it comes to doing types with TypeScript. Okay, cool. So this we're going to need for the client, because the client is going to know what the shape or what the design of our router is based on this type. Okay, and then this app router is going to be the object we can then use, in different places, as you'll see in a moment. Okay, so then I'm going to head over to the client here, and I can create a client that I can then use in my routes. Okay, so I'm going to bring in that app router type. Okay, and I'm also going to bring in these things. Okay, and we'll kind of go through as we go. Basically, what you're doing is you're creating a client, so that's what this function is doing. It's creating a client that's applying this schema. Essentially, the type is acting as like the contract. So instead of you creating like a proto file like in gRPC, you're just using typing to create that contract. Okay, which is actually pretty nice. I can see why this is so cool. I've never used tRPC before today. Okay, logger link. Based on what I saw in the earlier, these are just different cool logs that you get in the browser, which are actually pretty nice. And then this is the URL. Basically, you're saying, hey, when you use this client, the request should be this is the endpoint where those requests should be going towards. Okay, so the basic what I need to do now is that in our routes, I need to make sure that this /tRPC URL is configured to handle these requests. Okay, so we've configured, basically we defined our API through these two files here. We defined the client, and again, this gets a lot easier once you get all these pieces in place. Adding additional functions becomes easy because you're just adding them to that router. Okay, so it's just the initial setup that's a little bit of work. Okay, so then I'm gonna go create the file. So again, if the endpoint is /tRPC, I'm gonna create in my routes folder. I'm gonna create a folder called tRPC, but I want to create a catch-all route. Okay, so that's gonna be the 3 dots. That means this literally any permutation possible. And the reason you want that is because what's going to do is at the end of the URL, it's going to be like making a request to like /hello, /goodbye, depending on which function you're calling. So you want it to be able to handle any of those things. Okay, so we're going to grab the API event just for typing purposes. Now the fetch request handler, what it does is that basically, again, solid start is using the web API. So essentially what it does is for its function, its route handlers, it's copying the fetch API. So it's following the format of the way fetch works in the browser. Okay, so what this fetch request handler does, it basically leans into that API so that way it knows how to handle that coming in. So essentially what this does is you're just creating a function that basically passes using this endpoint. Okay, so basically it knows that this is the endpoint. It's passing the event.request because again, this is the event API, so it's passing the request object. Okay, it's passing the router. So again, this is why we needed that router object. Okay, so it's passing the router object, so it knows that hey, anytime a request comes in, okay, if the endpoint is this, okay, we're going to use this request object. So here's where we're going to go look for like the body and stuff like that in case there's any arguments being passed in. We're going to then use all the functions that are defined in this particular router. So I can create multiple tRPC endpoints, okay, with multiple routers that have different batches of functions if I wanted to. I don't know why I would do that. I mean, I guess you could do it for organization purposes, but honestly, just one endpoint kind of does the job, and you can just design all your functions in there. Okay, and this create context function, I have a feeling that this, knowing how context is used in a lot of different frameworks like GraphQL and stuff like that, my assumption here is that you can pass in sort of an arbitrary set of data that'll then appear in that set of arguments. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually add something here. I'm going to say cheese Gouda. Okay, I'm going to test my theory out. So because basically we saw that I console logged the entire set of arguments being passed to this function. So my guess is going to be that this object will then get passed to that, will be inside that args array. So we're going to test that theory out. Okay, so but essentially that's it. Okay, so essentially again, we have to create the tRPC server. That was the init.m. we create the router. The router is where we list all our functions. And then we create a client that matches that type of the router. And then we create an endpoint that handles that router. And then that's it. And the cool thing is that now I can import the app router. Okay, so like let me just show an example. We import the client. So if we go back to my bread endpoint here, see, I just import the client that we created from the client file. And now I can call whatever. And now I can go here. Now I can just be like client.goodbye.query. Okay, and then do like a dot then. And again, I don't have to do a dot then. I mean, if I were doing this in like, let's say I was doing some sort of like action where I could pass in an async function, I can then use await and stuff like that. And again, that's generally where you're going to be using this inside your actions because you're, making a new thing or something. So r equals console.log_r. Okay, console log the response, and let's just see this at work. npm run dev. Okay, and you see this just looks like I'm calling a function, and that's kind of like the beauty of it. So let's go to where it looks like it's over here. Okay, and yep, there it is. Yeah, there's my console log of hello and goodbye. So this is where that log, remember like that log link thing that we passed in there in that array? That's what it's doing, like these nice little console logs that shows you like the request. So this is like the are sending the query, so we can see kind of like what's going into the query, and then like what the response is. Okay. Okay, although the context is empty. Interesting. Even though we did pass, but let me see here. Let's go back to over here. Yep, there it is. So remember I mentioned that like, hey, I bet you that that context object is going to be passed in to in the arguments, but there it is. So you see in this one object, it's the one argument. We have the context, and then we can see there's all these other arguments. There's the input. Okay, the next function I'm assuming is going to be if we use middleware. Raw input, so forth. So yeah, so basically you could pass in. So again, you can have that when you create the endpoint, you can pass in context, pass in like arbitrary information you want available to like all your functions for whatever reason. Okay, which could be like let's say like data from like a session cookie or something like that. So that way you have like the logged in user's information or something like that. But yeah, so that's how you implement the tRPC server with using solid start. It's actually not hard at all, and I can totally see like how cool this is. And again, this is only necessary if you really want to have like tRPC or RPC endpoints that you can use across your application. And the cool thing about setting this all up is that you can even use them, like you could just like if I go here, I go to localhost 3000 /trpc /hello. See, I'm going to get that response because again, that's technically when you call that function, what it's doing is just sending the right request to the server to handle to call the right function. But the idea is that you're abstracting away making those fetch requests, which is what's nice about RPC because then it just feels like you're calling a function. Okay, so you can do that, but again, you could always just if you just need to create like a one-off RPC call that you just need in sort of like one route, then you can use like that server $sign function that we talked about in an earlier video. So you got options. Solid Start really kind of makes it easy to kind of implement all these different patterns. I'm definitely going to be playing more and more with this because the more I play with this, the more I like it. So yeah, this is cool stuff. I'll see y'all later. Have a great day and enjoy.